generations that have now got going over a drink and perhaps a pint to eat. But if we could perhaps reconvene, I'm sure there are some burning questions and discussions. So would anybody like to kick off with the first question for Holger? Go ahead. I need to speak up, we're quite a rowdy bunch tonight.
Diets are fashionable at the moment. Do they have any resemblance to a historically accurate Paleolithic diet? And does it have any benefits at all? Or do you not know what I'm talking about?
I couldn't hear the question.
Okay, so the question is whether what isotope analysis reveals has any resemblance with an accurate Paleolithic diet?
With this fashionable paleo diet.
Oh, right. Well, it is in fact based on it. But, so this is just Atkins stuff. There is some truth to it, because if you picture yourself as an Eskimo, okay? So you live somewhere where there is little plant matter, and therefore you eat on something that is mostly meat and fat. You can live on that, but it's very costly in terms of your metabolism. Basically, you need to convert meat or proteins and fat into sugar to feed your brain. You can do that, but if you do that as part of this diet, you will burn all your fat. That's the idea. Whether that resembles anything that people really did is a different matter entirely. It's also not thought to be extremely healthy. And we know that Eskimos, for example, do have serious issues with, for example, calcium supply, simply because there's so little to be had, unless you crush bones and eat them. Yes, please.
What does the 5-2 diet say about an individual?
The 5-2 diet.
Yeah.
If you could just brief me on what
It's 5 days of feeding and
5 days eating, 2 days fasting.
Oh, I couldn't tell. I'm not into diets.
don't you watch television?
It doesn't need to.
Tell me which features I should be. Sean, do you want to step in?
I think the idea of that diet is that it tricks your metabolism, because if you decrease the calories that you're eating, your metabolism will start to go into a fasting mode. And if you then trick it back by eating normally, then it thinks it's not fasting. So when you actually do fast, the loss is more permanent, theoretically. That's the idea, that's the story that they sell with regard to that diet. Works for me.
I thought it had to do with the way that your body used some, glucagon and some of the materials in the glucose materials that would affect. They sell it as you become less susceptible to diabetes.
And there is some evidence to suggest that's correct.
Yeah.
And some people have been suffering type 2 diabetes who've gone on low-calorie, 500 calorie a day diets. It has turned, there is some evidence to say it's turned that round, which is, having had a father who just died of type 2 diabetes, maybe that would have been handy if he'd known that. However, knowing my father's eating habits, there is no way he would live on 500 or would have lived on 500 calories a day.
Thank you. All completely filled.
Yeah.
You were talking about the people who had weapons and the people who didn't have weapons.
Mm-hmm.
They ate a different diet.
Yes.
Now, was there any difference in how their brains work? Because the diets are different, were their brains different? Are the bones different, or the
In terms
size, or
do they look different?
Yeah.
Yes, funnily enough, in this case, these
Can you
people who
repeat
have...
the question? Oh yeah. Can you repeat
Right.
it?
The question was about this example from the Iron Age and the Bohemian warriors. The question was whether the bones of those people who had more meat in their diet, whether the bones looked different. One of the features indeed that was different was that those people who ate more meat were taller on average. And in this case it was. Yes. It doesn't work in every instance, but in this particular instance it was the case. Yes.
Do you know of any research that's being undertaken at the moment into sort of current skeletons and people who have died to look at the different effects of ridiculous diets and cultures of dieting on our bodies now? The impact of...
Well, we certainly know the effect of unhealthy diet. We know that very well because it increases things like diabetes, coronary heart disease, and all the bad effects of obesity. We know that very well. Detrimental effects of dieting, apart from the fact that most of them don't work, is probably a different matter.
Does it show in the skeletons though? I mean, we know the detrimental effects these days of the diabetes and the heart disease stuff. Is that showing up in the skeletons? And your ratios that you have on slides?
We don't have the data for that, but I would doubt that it shows because this type of analysis doesn't give you the resolution to identify very short-term changes in your diet. The examples I showed are the sort of averages over the last 5 or 10 years before you die.
But do you think in the past they would have had more kind of static diets, whereas at the moment we've got such a diverse range of different eating fats from one year to the next that this will have such a random effect on different people's biological makeup that you're not going to be able to identify things like that in the future? There's just too many variables.
That is very likely, simply because it was much more reliant on what was directly available. This situation we have today where you can go to the supermarket and open your fridge every day and get the most exotic stuff that under normal circumstances would not be seasonal is not really a natural situation. We all like it, but it is not what people have until, very recently. And some people, or most people in the world, don't even have that still, because they live on what is seasonally available, and that usually has overall less variety than we are pampered with at the moment.
There is some evidence of increasing rickets as a sort of vitamin D deficiency. Now, whether that would be as a result of decreased consumption of dairy products or decreased exposure to sunlight.
Yes, all these hypotheses about the origin of rickets and vitamin D production in sunlight is probably the most important one. And in fact, we do find increased rickets in Asian enclaves of the country. I've been in Bradford before I came to Bournemouth, and there are whole parts of the city where you have an entirely Asian population, and all the women are veiled and locked away, and very, very rarely see daylight. And the children do have rickets, but it's not reported. But there's a high sort of grey figure of that.
Can I just sort of pick up on that in terms of variation with diets, and whereas historically we may have seen individuals not having the choice that we do now, but equally on the flip side, can you tell much about, for example, periods of famine, perhaps owed to climate change and those sorts of things? What are the other sorts of things you mentioned? Kind of some of the more social kind of political context people are in.
Yes.
What can our sort of archaeology tell us about that?
Famine is actually an interesting one, because if you are if you are deprived of food for a longer period of time, what you essentially start to do is you start to digest yourself in inverted commas, and that indeed increases your nitrogen values in your bone collagen. So yes, if that happens over a sustained period of time, you're beginning to pick that up. And there has been some very interesting research lately on skeletons of Irish who suffered from the Irish famine and ended up in London. And this is, well, you know, in very subtle differences, but this is what you're beginning to pick up.
Does, if the diet is really poor over generations, will it become a genetic effect? No, it would never. It couldn't. No, when it comes to bones.
Not genetic in terms of causing mutations, but we know that there is something very interesting going on, which is called epigenetics, and it has to do with some kind of chemical alteration of the DNA molecule. That, for example, people who grew up under very constrained and harsh conditions may show this slight change to their DNA molecule and pass that on as acquired information, which is actually quite unorthodox in terms of understanding how genetics work. But this is only in the beginning.
Sorry, another question. Has all of this changed your diet and your approach to food? Has your research changed your approach to food and your diet and your attitude?
I don't think I have ever had a very unhealthy diet, and I don't know. I think overall I'm more conscious about what I'm eating. But I would pay a lot of attention to that. It's a different matter. But,
Still eat cake and chocolate and drink
I do
wine?
eat chocolate. Yes, I love chocolate because I'm a true believer that every now and then you do need chocolate. And also drink wine.
What's your favourite food?
That's a good one.
Chocolate with red wine cheese.
Wine and cheese is good. You got me there because I'm quite, I don't know, I sample widely.
What do you think about the blood group diet? Have you heard of that one?
The blood group?
Yeah, different blood groups are supposed to be
Complete pass.
programmed.
I'm sorry. Again.
No. Sounds like something from Twilight.
Some theories that different blood groups are sort of programmed to be able to eat different things, like A is meat. Never heard of it?
I've heard of it.
Yeah.
I've had it multiple
It
times.
sounds like there's just making a lot of money selling books.
Yeah.
Should we better like that?
Just like
Should we better
just
Is that because the coffee diet?
Okay.
Sorry, can you repeat that question for us?
Yeah, but there may be some very weak relation because people with blood group B, there is a sort of tapering gradient in the frequency of blood group B from Central Asia into Europe, and people always say this has to do with the Mongol invasion. Okay, so all blood group B frequency we have in Europe is a sort of reminiscent of what happened 1,000 years ago or so. And we know that there is a geographical difference in people's ability to digest milk as adults. Okay? This is known as lactose intolerance. Normally we shouldn't be able to do that because once we have been weaned off, we lose the ability, or the enzyme loses its capacity by 90% actually to digest milk in larger quantities. That's quite natural. For whatever reason, this is actually a very interesting one, because this is one of the finest examples of what we call gene culture co-evolution. So you develop some kind of method of food production, which is large herds of cattle that you milk. And if you live off that, and don't digest milk, that's not a good idea. Okay? So, all people in that population who are able, because there are always some who can, still digest milk as adults, all people who have that capacity have, in theory, a better chance of reproducing themselves, and the frequency for that particular gene will therefore increase in the population. So, therefore, because we have a high frequency of blood group B in Central Asia, and we know that people in Central Asia have difficulties with digesting milk, there may be a connection. Whether that's generalizable, I'm not sure. Yes?
What about people's ability to digest gluten?
Some can't, others can.
No, I've just heard that maybe there are more people who can't digest gluten than were previously supposed.
I think we make bread in a very different way than we used to make bread. And there's also anecdotal evidence of higher milk allergies within the population. But then when a cow's milk is taken to a creamery, it is automatically, all the milk is skimmed. And then certain amounts of fat are added back to the milk, and then to give you your skimmed, semi-skimmed and full fat, and then the whole lot is homogenized. And a very good friend of mine, an organic farmer, put forward a hypothesis that the homogenization process affects the digestive qualities of the milk, allowing certain milk proteins that wouldn't have been digested, that would have been digested in the gut, to actually go from the gut straight into the bloodstream, and that might be why we see more conditions which people describe as milk allergies. The process we use for making bread, the industrial process, whose name I forget. Surely would, yeah. Surely would, there you go. It's one of the blessings of dyslexia. I sometimes forget my daughter's names in the morning. My wife is, when I forget her name, it's more problematic.
I know, as a starter, I'm Claire and Thomas.
All right. The Chorley-Wood process, some people are very critical about the Chorley-Wood process and the rapid fermentation and the quality of the bread that's produced. So there are all sorts of things related to that, and maybe chemicals that are used in the production of wheat and different varieties of wheat that have been selected. Most recently, there's been in Cambridge University, working with the National Institute of Agricultural Botany, have selected a new type of wheat by back-crossing to primitive wheats, which they think may well increase production by 50%. But then there may well be other characteristics which come along with that, depending on your perspective.
Thank you.
That's all right. That's not my gigs.
I just think that, well, first of all, the sudden rise in gluten intolerance seems suspect to me, just because people have been eating noodles since they came over from Asia. And I've read a few things about the actual species of the wheat germ being changed through genetic modification or certain agricultural processes over the last 50 years. That the original species are almost impossible to find. Sometimes there's a few places in Italy that still produce the sort of wheat that humans were used to eating for thousands of years. But beyond that, this sudden surgence of allergies across the board just seems counterintuitive to the idea of evolution. Why did the genes that suddenly make you die from nuts? Why weren't those people sort of weeded out?
Under normal circumstances there would be, but on an evolutionary scale. But since over the last 50 or 100 years or so, we have changed our food production methods so dramatically, and we have created all sorts of artificially designed foodstuffs, including new varieties of genetically engineered grain or something, you know, on those timescales, evolution doesn't really work in the sense that you could give people to genetically adapt to these things, or just die because they can't tolerate it. So we treat that with medication, or people just eat something else. That's the answer. But there is no evolutionary timescale involved here because the time frame is short.
So do you think by having all this choice here, and so many people are coming out and saying, I can't eat gluten all of a sudden, and they say, I can't, whereas I sometimes think maybe you just choose to not eating gluten and confuse that. Do you think we eventually ruin ourselves in a way that it would be the same as if all of a sudden a Japanese or a Chinese person would say, oh, I can't eat rice, and that would be, you know, I mean, is it detrimental to have that choice in the end? Do you think this effect could?
I don't think choice is the problem. I just think awareness is much more important. And you know, people have difficulties in the past, you know, digesting certain food items as well. But maybe they weren't so lucky and get some treatment, so they just died and nobody recognized. And so, you know, and so the problem is that when you start to introduce food items that are unnatural into your choice, and then it becomes difficult. But again, you know, even I'm a great believer in human adaptability. So if you would give people enough time to even genetically adapt to that would work. But you know, the pace of life is so quick, and it doesn't really match with evolutionary timescale. So I don't think choice is the problem, but I think that the ability to adjust and eventually adapt is something that doesn't keep pace.
On that note of choice, and I forget the name of the root, was it Madio? The poison? Yeah. How did we get from the point whereby someone came along, munched a bit, obviously didn't do them so much good, to learn how to do that whole, what theories do we have of how we've learned to understand to process certain foods to actually make them nutritious rather than poisonous?
What you mostly read about this is trial and error.
Trial and error.
And you know, sometimes for some people that trial didn't really work. No, it is what if you live in such an environment where you have a lot of tubers and roots, you know that in principle these are extremely nutritious, and sometimes you pick one that isn't so good. But if it is abundant, then you maybe just start to try in the preparation whether there's anything that allows you to utilize that resource, because otherwise it would be a great waste of something that is naturally available. And I think this is the process by which people have to start and have started to really try different things. And on the other hand, you know, if you eat untreated manure only in small quantities, you wouldn't really eat it because it is so disgusting. You know, you can't eat it, and if you are a pretty foolish guy, and so that comes with a certain punishment. And therefore, I think this is what people have found out. I mean, they have probably tried preparation techniques on things that are perfectly fine and are not toxic, and then have adapted that to something that needs a bit more preparation. This is normally the way it would go.
It's interesting, isn't it? Parallels between modern food production and some of the difficulties that we're encountering, and actually where foodstuffs have become, and I'm not sure if that is necessarily an equal comparison that you can make, but there's something very interesting there for me about that adaptation to diets and what is appropriate and good for us and keeps us alive, and what actually be potentially harmful.
Yeah. I mean, one of the fascinating insights we have from the so-called natural populations, hunter-gatherers, foragers, call them whatever you like, that were still living in a very traditional way, say 50 years ago, is that they have an enormous knowledge about plants and animals that are edible, but only about the quarter or so of animals and plants are actually being used on a regular basis, be it because they are abundant and therefore readily available, or they are preferred. And preference it actually is very important. But all the others are kept as active knowledge, as fallback food, for example. And so people have a very, very good idea, and that they are mapping their environment in terms of what is available, what can I eat, and what is actually digestible, and what doesn't do me any harm. Whether they always choose it is a different matter entirely. They normally don't, because they have taste preferences as we do. And if they can go for something they like better, like palm hearts or armadillos or whatever, then they would do that. But if that is not available, then they use something else which is also available, and where within that community there is active knowledge about it.
Do you have the references for those pictures you had at the beginning, with the vegetarian and the
Yes, yes. It is Sadella and Burroughs, 1981. Okay. You can email me and I can send you the reference. It's in Psychology Today.
Yeah, one question back here.
It seems for like being years and females are being consuming more foods that have eaten more milk than men. So if you have a museum at a fragment of bone, you should be sure it's human, but you couldn't tell the gender. If you look at like the calcium content of the bone, would that be a factor to consider when trying to determine gender?
Okay. We know that males and females differ in the amount of milk in the bone, but there is an overlap. So if you have an isolated piece of bone and would measure the calcium content in it, then only if you're really lucky and it falls very clearly into the variation that is known from women, will you be able to make a suggestion, but you wouldn't be able to really pinpoint that. But under normal circumstances, the overlap is there. But in general, we know that the males tend to have higher mineral content in their skin.
Do you think there's a correlation between the fact that women are more susceptible to osteoporosis and the fact that they traditionally or very
The osteoporosis is something that normally is triggered by hormonal change after menopause.
yes, so
And therefore, well, it can be countered actually by higher calcium intake. Yes, for example, milk products are the best recipe to counter that to a certain degree.
Just talking about the epigenetics, and I don't know if this is an answerable question, but I've thought a lot about the idea of how long evolutionarily it takes for people to adjust, to adapt to a diet or something like that. I mean, you think about Asians they don't have the it's not the alcohol, the aldehyde dehydrogenase to I thought it was actually the next one that they lack.
They can't trigger it.
Yeah, basically. The missing enzyme, or they have lesser enzyme. And is that because I thought beer was basically, really wheat beer was invented in Mesopotamia, 6,000 years ago. And is that, has there been obviously a split in people in the West and in the East? And did we all start off the same and develop that enzyme over thousands of years of drinking mildly fermented water, sweet water? And then from there, how long would it take? Do they have an estimation as to how long it would take for people to overall adapt to a new sort of stuff? And especially nowadays, since we're talking about all these genetically engineered molecules, what's going to happen on a biomolecular basis in the future? Are we ever going to be able to adapt to these changes, or? Because my original question is there any idea as to how long these adaptations take?
In the case of adaptation to lactose, so the tolerance for milk sugar, that was a matter of a few thousand years. that the frequency in those areas where people live off dairy products, or where that is a big part of their diet, that the frequency for lactose tolerance in the population increased quite dramatically over a relatively short period of time. The ability to digest alcohol is probably not that likely. But in Asian populations, we do have two variants. There are actually people who can drink like any other people who don't have that problem, but the other half of the population, if you like, they have either lesser activity or lesser amount of that enzyme that is needed to digest alcohol. And they just drop earlier. So it can go very quickly, and then there are quite dramatic selection pressures that operate on those people that have this obvious genetic advantage for being able to digest a particular type of food, if that is conducive, and that can go very quickly. But in general, it would take
The alcohol, I mean, not you, yeah. But it was actually, archaeologically, it was an important thing that they learned from that alcohol, because it gave them a way to drink, to hydrate themselves.
That's right.
Do you think that our ability to assimilate came from thousands of years of slightly fermenting this stuff? Or?
That's a chicken and egg question.
You really want to answer.
No, I don't know that answer, but certainly the ability, a gene that codes for the enzyme it doesn't do any harm, so it can be just there, the system is neutral, and if the occasion comes that you can use it because you can digest alcohol, then that's fine. But this is not necessarily right.
It's a one enzyme that you have, and that digests alcohol, and it doesn't do anything else.
This is mainly, yes.
Oh, yeah,
There's one particular enzyme that
That's what it
allows
does.
you to digest alcohol in larger quantities if you have it.
I just actually thought that the gene that helps you digest alcohol would actually be subject to sexual selection as well. So.
Is it?
You've got double pressure on it.
Maybe this is just maybe it codes for how to camouflage your behavioural deficiencies.
And shut up women.
Or men.
Or men, obviously.
Okay, well, I'm sure discussion will continue informally. I've got a couple of last questions, which feel free to answer or not. I am quite intrigued to know how many Neanderthal men did a woolly mammoth feed, because they must have fed quite a lot, I would have thought. But the other thing I'm interested in is, in 1,000 years' time, what do you think bioarchaeologists might be saying about our skeletons in the room? So,
I think they get relatively healthy people, at least at that age. The older we get, the more fascinating things we can detect on people, just as a matter of natural wear and tear. This is what we find fascinating, to see all the little extra bits that start to grow on our bones, and that causes squeaking and all that. But no, in general, I would think that there is this, I think, an increasing awareness about eating and food and quality, and we are in that lucky position that we are actually looking forward. Then we should forget it. That is not the case for all of our people. So I suppose in that respect, we may actually encounter quite boring skeletons.
well, I'm sure your forefathers in 1,000 years in the future will find something interesting to say about our skeletons, but we're not going to be. Can I just say an enormous thank you to Holger? I think it was a really fascinating talk, and thank you all so much for coming along tonight. Thanks again.
Thank you.